Shalom. I'm going to be talking this week about Vayeishev. Jacob settles in the land. To begin with, I want to give you a precursor to where we're going, and at the same point in time, point you to the end. Now, from the beginning, I mean, this lesson deals with the separation between Joseph being sent away, and the rest of his brothers. Technically, there's really been a rift in the family since the very beginning. It started with the fact that Leah became the first wife and Rachel, who he loved, became the second wife. And so there's been a constant struggle between even the women, as Leah found herself wanting to be more than just simply the second wife. And so she had a great number of kids. But then the rift extended over into the sons. The rift became a rift between Judah and Joseph, which we will find later on in other parshas. But at this simply point in time, I just want to note that this rift will not end until Ezekiel comes, and we move towards the time when the two sticks will come together, when Joseph and Ephraim, or Joseph, Ephraim, and Judah again find themselves in lockstep. Now, in our story then, I want you to understand, Reuben should have been the oldest and should have been given the position of number one, but he lost that position when he became upset when his father, Jacob, decided he was going to have his tent with Bilhah, which was Rachel's concubine, because Rachel had passed away. So he took it away from him. Later, we see that it left Levi and Simeon. Both of them lost their privilege because of what happened at Shechem. So it really boiled down to Judah was now seen as the star on the side of Leah's family. But at the same point in time, Jacob doesn't give the right of the firstborn to Judah. He gives it to Joseph instead. But we understand Joseph was the first son given to Rachel. So therefore, he had some logic in what he was doing. But as we go through this, I want you to understand that the boys saw Jacob's love for Joseph more than theirs. If we go back to 37:3, the beginning of our story, we notice the fact that it says, now Israel loved Joseph more than all of the sons, since he was a child of his old age, and he made him a fine woolen garment. Now, the concept of this fine woolen garment is really spoken of in the Hebrew as being a little bit different. Now, some thought that this garment that he had was actually the robe that belonged to the mantle that belonged to Adam. But it appears as though if it was that one, it's been modified, because notice it says that it is a colorful garment of fine linen. And so as you go to the story, the word used for colorful is the word that seflim or feslim. And the concept is that it's really a embroidery or a striping or some sort of illustration on the garment. It's not directly tied to the fact of being the first garment. So our story then goes from there to having a rift between the two. Now, we know that the rift was extenuated when we find that the boys, or that Jacob, trying to get some reconciliation to the boys, sent Joseph to the boys who were far away. Understand that Jacob was living at Hebron at the point in time, but he also had that plot of land up at Shechem. And so it was up by Shechem that the boys were. And so Joseph is sent to go to where they're at and to check on them. Well, Joseph has had a problem with checking on people because he usually brings back evil reports, kind of bolstering himself. But understand, he's a 17-year-old. I'm sure his maturity level is not the level that you would want it to be, but he is again a teenager. And so he goes up to check on them. And every time he had checked on them before, he had created an evil report. And that evil report really is part of the reason of his punishment in going down to Egypt the way he did. And it's also part of the punishment for Jacob, because Jacob listened to those stories and accepted them rather than to do something about it or to say something about it. So anyway, we find that there's lots of things that make Jacob and Joseph common. In fact, I started writing down a few of them and it got to be quite extensive, but I want to share some of the parallels between the lives of Jacob and Joseph before I go on. First off, Jacob and Joseph were said to be born circumcised. Rebecca and Rachel their mothers were both infertile. And Rachel and Rebecca had trouble in childbirth. Now, both mothers bore 2 sons. Jacob was hated by Esau, and Joseph was hated by the other 10. Both faced death threats because of their standings. Both were shepherds. Both took wives outside the land. Their father-in-laws were blessed by their presence, and both would die in Egypt and be embalmed, and both would be returned to the land. Now, Jacob would lose 22 years in this process, and at the same time, Joseph lost his father for 22 years. Jacob was indentured for a woman. Joseph was imprisoned because of a woman. Jacob supported Joseph his first 17 years, and Joseph supported Jacob his last 17 years. Now, there's a lot more commonality between the two, but that should give you an idea that the two were very much alike. In fact, again, it's one of those that said that they looked alike, that there was a resemblance. Now, remember, Jacob also resembled Isaac, and Isaac also resembled Avram. All of them are going to be in lockstep that way. The genetics are going to be very, very similar. So Jacob sends Joseph off to see his brothers at Shechem. By the way, Shechem, remember, is one of those places that is very famous. One, we know that that's the place where Dinah was raped. We know that that's also the place where Joseph is sold into slavery. And later on, in 1 Kings 12:1, we also will note that that is the place where the 2 nations came about. Jeroboam came and led the 10 nations, 10 tribes away from Judah and Benjamin. Okay, but let's pick up the story. Go down to 37:34 for a second, and let's start there. 37:34 says, then Jacob rent his garments and placed sackcloth on his loins. He mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to comfort himself. And he said, for I will go down to the grave mourning for my son. And his father bewailed him. Now we know that this happens just after the servants, not the sons, but the servants bring notice to Jacob, bringing the garment themselves that had been shredded and torn and had blood all over it. He at that point in time broke down. Now the sons are going to arrive later, but when they arrive, they're going to find their father in the same position, still moaning, still wailing over the loss of his son. And so there's this constant that's going on between them. Well, as the sons begin, according to the Midrash, as the sons begin to look upon what's going on here, the sons find themselves mad at Judah. Now, Judah is the one who had proposed that they not kill him, but that they send him into slavery, that they sell him off to the Ishmaelites. And in selling them off to the Ishmaelites, they pronounced him dead. And so nobody wants to tell him that, yeah, he's still alive, but he's down in Egypt. So the fable continues. But at the same point in time, the status of Judah diminishes, because we find that Judah will go down. Look at 31 or 38:1, because that's where I want to start our story. I want us to talk about Judah and Tamar. Now, it was at that time Judah went down from his brothers. In other words, he left them and he turned away towards an Adulamite man whose name was Hira. Now, in this going down, it's indicated that as a part of this process, Judah will end up marrying Shua, who's living in Israel or in the land, but was not a Canaanite. The boys understood that they were not to marry Canaanites, and so they were very specific. Now, Tamar will be later identified, and Shua will be identified as Canaanite women. But the word Canaanite can also mean merchants' daughters or merchants, and these would be daughters of merchants, not simply members of the Canaanite tribe. So as we go through this, we have to understand there's a lot going on. Now, Judah had lost his position with the family, and Judah goes down. In other words, it's a spiritual understanding also. Not only does he physically leave, but he also spiritually descends. He finds himself outside the clan. Now, as we go through it, I guess let's just start reading through the text and see where we go from here. Now, it says in 38, the second verse, then Judah saw the daughter of a prominent merchant, now whose name was Shua. Again, the word for merchant here is Canaanite. And he married her and consorted with her. Now she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name Er. And she conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. And yet again, and she bore a son, and called his name Shelah. And it was at Heshbed when she bore him. Now, as we go through the story of the boys, we have to understand that, first off, the oldest son is always named by the father. If there's a second son, he is named by the mother. And if there's a third son, he is named by the father. But as we understand, she named both number 2 and number 3. But let's go back to the story of who they are. Now, Judah names him Er, which comes from an expression, or at least it's thought to come from an expression called orah, which is to stir up thy might. So Judah was thinking in those terms. But if we look at the gematria of a word, or we look at the understandings of a word, remember each letter itself produces an idea. If you take it's spelled Aleph Resh, but you can also take it and reverse it, and it becomes Resh Aleph, or Ra, which is evil. And we find in our story that in verse 6, Judah took his wife for his firstborn, and gave her to Tamar. Well, will be evil. But look in 7, but Judah's firstborn, was evil in the eyes of Hashem, and Hashem caused him to die. So our first character dies, and he dies for a sin, but we are never told what that sin is going to be or what it was. But at the same time, then Judah said to Onan, consort with your brother's wife and enter into a levirate marriage with her and establish offspring for your brother. Now, we have had no concept of levirate marriages before. This is the first time it's ever mentioned. In fact, it's mentioned in the Torah, but it's not certain that anybody had ever practiced such a thing before. But here, again, Judah simply says, marry your brother's wife so that he can have a lineage, so that he can have a continuation of life. Now, Onan was not exactly interested in going through that process of giving him a wife. But anyway, so he goes to the point of calling him Onan. Shua called him that. And so we have to understand how did she arrive at that name, and what does that name mean? Well, the name means grief and mourning. Well, why would you call your son grief and mourning? it's understood in that culture. Saddam, the idea of Saddam is the fact that he was a hard birth. And so probably in Shua's life, the birth of Onan was not an easy thing. And so she calls him grief and mourning. And it's the same idea that Rachel had when she called her second son, which later became Benjamin, Ben Onin, which means son of my sorrow. So the concept has been carried on in the names of the children oftentimes, as they receive names based upon that. Yaakov gets his name because of Kev, the reaching out, the grabbing the heel grabber. We go on to understand then that she has a third son. Her third son is called Shelah, and and let's go back to the verse because it's very significant what it says about him. So in verse number, let's go to 9. But Onan knew that the seed would not be his, so it was that whenever he would consort with his brother's wife, he would let go to waste his seed on the ground so that as not to provide offspring for his brother. Now, they probably didn't exactly get along anyway, but he made sure that there was no way that she was going to get pregnant. What he did was evil in the eyes of Hashem, and he caused him to die also. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up, for he thought lest he also die like his brothers. So Tamar went and lived with her father's house. I still miss the story of Shelah. She bore, back in verse number 4, she bore a son and called his name Shelah, and it was in Hesbid that when she bore him. Now Hesbid itself may be a clue because Hesbid means to deceive. It's the idea of deceit. So Shelah may have been one who deceives. But I also need to explain some things to you. First off, when Judah gives his son away, he's only about 12. In those days, marriage came early in life, and it was an arranged marriage often. So Judah had arranged with Tamar's father, whose name was Shem, and Shem was a priest. So he chose a priest for his son. I'm assuming that he was attempting to make sure that his son would walk the straight and narrow. And so that's why he chose that. So anyway, he chooses his son. The second son marries Tamar. He also is about 12 years old by the time their marriage is arranged and confined together. And so Shelah is probably only 8, 9, maybe 10 years old. And so Judah now becomes worried. First off, is she a husband killer by her actions? How is it that 2 of my children have died? No visible signs of death, but yet both of them are now dead. What's going on? And so he denies her and sends her away and says, when he gets old enough, then I'll give him to you. But he had no intentions of ever doing that. His only intention was to send her away. Now, when he sends her away, the custom was that she was to return to the house to wait for Shelah to be old enough. Now, in this waiting period, the custom was that the woman would wear black and she would cover her face, and she would remain that way until she was given in marriage to the next son in line. So she obviously was doing what she was supposed to. She had gone through that whole process. Look at verse 12. Many days passed, and Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died when Judah was consoled, and he went up to oversee his sheep bearers. And he and his Adulamite friend Hira went to Timnah. She's been staying at home waiting. In the meantime, Judah's wife passes away. Now, in the process, then, we find her no longer around, and Judah consoles himself. And by consoling himself, he chose to go up to where they were sheep shearing. Now, again, his sheep, Judah's sheep, remember, he separated from his brothers. And so his sheep were at Timnah. Now, there were two Timnahs, and so we're not sure which one he actually was at. But it gives us something of a hint at the same time. You see, in the book of Judges, Samson also went to Timnah. But in Judges, when he went to Timnah, he went down to Timnah. And Judah, when he goes up to Timnah. Now, Timnah was supposedly on the side of a hill, so it's easy to see that he approached from the bottom and came up, and Samson came from the top and came down. But that's one of those things that even the rabbis question whether that was truly what this was about, or whether it was all about, or more about the direction of their lives at that point. Because remember, when Samson gets to Timnah, he's going to find a Philistine wife there, and he's going to marry her. And in the process of that marriage, he will end up killing 100 Philistines because of a bet that he had in order to get the robes that he needed in order to cover his bet. But we also know that Timnah, as Judah goes up, has a spiritual significance to it, or appears to have a spiritual significance as we go through the story. So he goes to this city, and whenever sheep shearing season was on, it was understood that it was more of a festival as well as a cutting of the hair. And so even the impoverished would go up, because that would be a time when they would slaughter lambs, and they would have a giant festival regarding what was going on while they were shearing the sheep. And understand that this shearing would not end in one day. It would be a multiple day event. And so that's the surroundings of what's going on. And so he passes up through Timnah at that point in time. Now, Tamar was told as follows: "Behold, your father-in-law is coming up to Timnah to shear his sheep." So he removed her widow's garments. So she removed her widow's garments from upon her, covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself up. And then she sat down by the crossroads, which is on the road towards Timnah. So she's not at Timnah, but she's on a crossroads leading up there, where she assumes that Judah will pass by. Now, notice that she puts on a veil, so she's not easily seen. Now, according to the rabbis, Tamar had always worn a veil when she was in the presence of Jacob, or in the presence of Judah. She never took it off. So Judah never really ever saw her face. He only saw that she was with her husband at that point in time, and that she was a fair woman. And so anyway, he continues to go up to see where she's at. Now, at this particular point in time, she sits down at the crossroads waiting for him to go by. Now, the text goes on to say that it says, verse 13, "And Tamar was told," she went up there. Verse 15, "And when Judah saw her, he thought her to be a harlot, since she had covered her face." Now, so he detoured by her to her by the road and said, "Come, if we please, let me consort with you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. The idea is he detoured. The rabbis believe that explains that Judah wasn't originally going to sit down with Tamar. He had to be convinced to turn around, to take a detour, to come back to where she was at. Now, the detour was caused, according to the rabbis, in a midrashic writing, by God. God sent an angel of lust that caused Judah to look upon her favorably. And so he turned around and went down to her. Now, she said, "What will you give me if you consort with me?" And he replied, "I will send you a kid of the goats from the flock." But she said, "Provide you leave a pledge until you send it." So in other words, she wanted something immediate at that point in time. So She replied, your signet, your wrap, and your staff that is in your hand. Now, some texts say it was his cloak. Of course, if it would have been his cloak, then he would have been naked going down the road. So that probably wasn't what it was meaning. But the concept is strings. So she wanted his signet, his ring, which would identify as royalty. She wanted his strings, and she also wanted his staff that would have had the lion's head on it. That would have been his staff. So the strings then become the point of discussion. The strings then turned out to be, as most agree, was his talit. So he left 3 valuable pieces with her. Now, in leaving those 3 pieces, he gave them to her. He consorted with her. She conceived by him that night. Then she arose, left, and removed her veil from her upon her, and she put on her widow's garb again. So she again redressed as the widow. Now Judah would send the goat through his friend the Adulamite to retrieve his pledge from the woman, but he couldn't find her. Now he inquired of the people of her place, where is the prostitute, the one who at the crossroads by the road? And they said there was no prostitute here. So she had completed her mission, and she returned to where she was at, which was with their father Shem. So he returned to Judah and said, I did not find her. Even the local men said there was no prostitute here. So Judah said, let her keep them, lest we become a laughing stock. I really sent her this kid, but you could not find her. So the idea then is the fact that Judah sees in this whole thing, I can go look for her, but if I look for her, then I'm exposing myself to become what? You can't keep track of a prostitute? Doesn't a prostitute stay in one place? What's your problem? So rather than go through the embarrassment, he simply goes home without those 3 objects that she had taken with her. And it was when they were about 3 months had passed that Judah was told that your daughter-in-law, Tamar, had committed harlotry, or what we would probably call adultery. And moreover, she has conceived by this harlotry. So the notion is that Tamar had been unfaithful. She had chosen not to wait for Shelah, but had chosen another way. Now, let's be clear. First off, this is about a levirate marriage. And Judah had created this thing, or it appears that Judah had created it because it had never occurred before. And so he had passed it on from son to son. But if we go to the Torah, to the other text, we'll find out that a levirate marriage could also involve the father-in-law. The father-in-law could have married Tamar, and therefore he could have produced the son heir and moved on from there. But he chose not to. He chose instead not to let her marry any of his family, and chose to go around the whole thing. So in this process, then we find ourselves, looking at a confrontation. In the Midrash, it says that she conceived while she covered her face. So she was comfortable in what was going on. Now, there were 2 women in the scriptures that actually covered their face at all times. One was Tamar, but the first one was found in Genesis 24:65, and that was Rebecca. Rebecca was the first one to cover her face. Now, as the story goes on, Rabbi Meir said that Tamar was the daughter of Shem, who was a priest, and only then would she be susceptible to being called a harlot. In other words, any other woman would not have to face that punishment, but because of her religious standing and the family understanding, she deserved, according to the Sanhedrin 51b, she deserved to be burned at the stake, which when Jacob, or when Judah was told of the fact that his daughter-in-law had committed this harlotry, said immediately, she needs to be brought here and burned at the stake. In other words, she was of a position that was beyond all things. Now, as it goes on, it says in verse 25, and as she was taken out, she sent word to her father-in-law saying, by the man to whom these belong, am I with child? And she said, identify, if you please, whose are the signet, the wrap, and the staff. So the same words are used. Jacob, when he wanted them to identify him, used the exact same thing. When Joseph was to be identified by Jacob, they used the identical words that were used there. So she sent ahead. It doesn't say how or with whom she sent it. We can always speculate that it was an angel who carried them ahead of her and gave them to him. But when they got there, verse 26, Judah recognized, and he said, she is right. It is from me, inasmuch as I did not give her Shula, my son, and he was not intimate with her anymore. Well, that part of the verse is questionable, but let's go back to it. He finally admits to the fact that she was the one with whom he had been intimate. Now, the fact that she was not intimate with him anymore is subject of the language, and the language is not clear. It is ancient text. The words themselves have similar meanings, but they're not necessarily the same. Now, in 26, he basically was telling us she is right or she is righteous. That was the first part of our story. She was righteous from me. So she did what she had to do in order to maintain the leveret. And so again, it was the divine voice came to Judah, indicating from me and from my authority. Let's go back. So Judah gets the gifts, but he still questions what's going on. But according to the Midrashic writing, after receiving the gifts and seeing the gifts and holding the gifts, he begins to question, how did she get them? And it was at that point that the voice, the Bat Kol, spoke to him, indicating this was from me. I brought this all about. This is what happens. So he would choose never to be with her again. But the point, that is the point of debate, since she was his wife and he did not cease from living with her. There's an understanding that there may have been a relationship beyond the simple relationship. Now, Rabbi Nakun talks about the two boys because we have very little information. It says in verse number 29, and it was as he drew back his hand, and behold, his brother emerged. Oh, we got to go back earlier, don't we? 27. And it came to pass at that time that she gave birth to that, behold, there were twins in her womb. And it happened that she gave birth, one put out his hand, and the midwife took a crimson thread and tied it onto his hand, saying, this one emerged first. And it was as he drew back his hand that, behold, his brother emerged and said, with what strength you asserted yourself. And he called his name Peretz. After his brother, on whose hand was the crimson thread, he came out, he called his name Zerah. Now the word Peretz is the word for breaking out or breaking through. And the word for Zerah is shining. So the first one put his hand out and he became the shining one. The rabbis compare this birth to the idea of the sun and the moon. Again, twins are uncommon. We're not told of many twins, although we're told that by Midrashic writings that each of Jacob's sons was actually a twin, only he was a boy and a girl. Here, And in the case of Isaac and Rebekah, both had sets of twins and both were boys. And so the connotation is, as we go through this, that they had an understanding or an interesting part. So Peretz, which broke through, is the second one out. The shining came first, indicating first off that the shining represented the sun. The sun is always up. The sun comes and shines always. But at the same point in time, Peretz breaks through this mantle. In other words, it comes and goes. It breaks down. It goes from no moon to full moon to half moon and back up again. So the concept is that Israel is associated with the moon. The calendar is based on the lunar calendar. All of the things spoke to the moon. Peretz is the son that is going to, or yes, Peretz is the son that will be born, that will break through. He will be the one who brings peace back to the land. He breaks through the evil that's there. He is the reason for the founding of the Mashiach. He's an example of that first character. We know it comes through the lineage of Judah. We're told that in the Genesis 49 accounts. And now Peretz is as our first singular event, which is interesting because we find that obviously the birth of this character is such that, well, we're starting with something that is less than pleasant. It's we go from here, we will go to Lot having relationships with his daughter, and his daughter Moab will produce a son. That son, again, moving through the lineages, we continually find ourselves staring at that which is really uncomfortable if you're looking for a king. But that's the system that God has used, because God, remember, has to deal with not only men, but he also deals with angels, and the angels don't want the Messiah to be born. So the angels counteract by saying he can't be born in this house or this house. And so God allows him to be born in a house that we would consider not to be righteous, and then would move from there into the other. That's about all I want to share right now. We'll share more of this next time as we go into maquettes. But I appreciate the fact that you've been listening to me. May you have a blessed day. Shalom.